Hello and welcome to this deep dive conversation. With me to discuss the human rights of lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, intersex and queer people is the London-based activist Nigel Warner. Nigel's campaigning work to advance the rights of LGBTIQ people dates back to the 1970s. Nigel has been an important contributor to the work of ILGA-Europe, an international gay and lesbian movement, and since 1998 has been the organisation's advisor to the Council of Europe. In 2010, Nigel led ILGA-Europe's advocacy of the world's first ever comprehensive intergovernmental agreement on LGBT rights, namely the Council of Europe's recommendation on LGBT rights. And in Her Majesty the Queen of England's New Year's Honours List, announced on the 30th of December 2014, Nigel was awarded an MBE for his work in support of the LGBTI community, both in Europe and internationally. And I'm delighted to speak with him today. Nigel Warner, very welcome to this Council of Europe Human Rights podcast.
Good morning, and thank you for inviting me to take part.
So, Nigel, straight away, how did you become involved in LGBTIQ activism?
Well, that goes back a long way, as you just pointed out. Basically, when I came out, I was very angry. I'd grown up under criminal laws in the UK. Criminalisation wasn't until 1967. So when the first meeting I went to, actually, when I came out, I walked into a local community organisation, and they were having a discussion on gay law reform. And that inspired me, and I've been doing something similar ever since.
Is your activism a response to situations that you may well have encountered when the legal situation in the UK was more repressive than it is now?
It's a reaction to the psychological consequences of discrimination. So for me, growing up as a teenager in the UK, that was a very serious negative effect. So when finally I realised how stupid the whole thing was, I thought, well, you've got to do something about this. You can't sit here and let this go on. And so it's a personal reaction to the way in which I felt disadvantaged and damaged by the discrimination that existed in society and in the criminal law.
Talk me through a little bit about that. We can all imagine what that might mean, but it's much more powerful, I think, when the person affected puts it into words. So talk me through the emotions that you felt and the lessons that you've learned over the last 40 years or so.
It's a very common experience for LGBTI and Q people who are faced with discrimination. It affects you psychologically. It can affect you with violence. I've been attacked as a gay rights activist physically. So it can affect you in lots of ways. And I think so. When you come into activism, you're doing activism initially. You're doing it for a couple of, certainly in my case, for a couple of reasons. So first of all, anger. And secondly, it's also a therapy, actually. It's a way, it takes time to work out and get rid of all the self-oppression and the negative attitudes within you and affirm your identity and affirm who you are and affirm where you stand. So that's a very big and important part of it. And of course, I was doing that of course, what was a very big trigger for me personally were the ideas of gay liberation. So that I was sitting in the dark, kind of hating myself, and then suddenly, in the early 70s, there was this extraordinary stuff going on. There were these ideas coming from New York in '69 from Stonewall, and they said two very simple things. They said gay pride, following on, of course, from the Black Pride concept, and they said come out, and if we all come out, then people will know us, and that's the way to defeat discrimination. And those two very, very powerful ideas actually really gripped me, and they gripped millions of people. And so what we found in the early 70s was this rapidly growing movement, and it was growing in the UK. It was fun, it was anarchic, there was lots of opposition, we were out in the wilderness. And then I got going on that. I got involved politically through the main LGBT organisation, a lesbian and gay organisation it was in those days. I got involved with a law reform committee which we set up, and we began working on the UK Parliament, which was hopeless because we were getting into the Thatcher years. But we were approached at that stage by our Dutch colleagues, and they said, come on, it's time to set up an international organisation. And so our little committee held a meeting, convened a meeting, and invited people, and they came not just from Europe, which was what we were expecting, but they came from Australia, from New Zealand, and from the United States. and everyone said we want to have a global organisation. So this was 1978, and what we found then, of course, when we set up the organisation, was that the spirit of gay liberation was spreading everywhere. That we were soon getting membership applications from Latin America, from Japan, from Indonesia. It was an extraordinary sensation, and so that really builds your activism. If you're saying what gets you going, it's a matter of your own internal anger, but then it's also a matter of being inspired by these incredible, simple but very powerful ideas, which you can see straight away transforming lives all around the world. And so that's the beginning of it, and that's of course the beginning of where the International Lesbian Gay, what's now the International Lesbian Gay, Bisexual, Trans and Intersex Association came from.
Indeed, two very powerful and simple ideas, gay pride and come out. But what was the process in your particular situation? Did they capture something in you straight away, or was there a process of adaptation where you understood and were driven by these simple ideas? Because you must have been young at the time. You must have been not too long out of school.
Mid-20s.
And were you in London?
Yes, I was in London.
Okay.
Mid-20s.
So that was helpful, right?
Those ideas take time to break through. So, I mean, these things happen to different people in different ways. Some people are quite extraordinary. The small minority are brilliant, and they're just on the streets, and they get it instantly. They get it from their teenage years very often, and then they're out and they're fighting. Someone like me, and like many people, it takes a bit longer. It takes a few years for the ideas to seep in, for the self-oppression and the self-hate and the fear to kind of wear through that. And then you get to the point of coming out, and again, I think this is a very common experience. Coming out, it's like jumping off a cliff without a parachute. You're terrified of it because you know there's no way back. Once you come out, there's no way back, and so this is I think people have this huge threshold which you have to get over, and you come out, and then you're there. And once you're out, suddenly you wonder why you didn't do it before, and you find you're in this world of supportive people and campaigning people and people working together to change things. So I think that's probably the best I can do to describe it.
What was the motivation then? I get that there was a process where you understood just how powerful these ideas were, and then you came out, and as you said, it was like flying without a parachute. Was the activism, was that, as you said, just a personal therapy, or did you very quickly understand that you were part of a global experience and it was important to give expression to these ideas, and that you had a particular contribution to make, Nigel?
Well, the activism started with wanting to do parliamentary law reform, and that came from the fact that we still had discrimination in the law in the UK. It came from the fact that I had grown up under a criminal law, which I felt extremely angry about. And I just thought, well, we've got to we got to do something to change this. We can't just sit here and accept that this is and let the continuing discrimination go on. You've got to change it. So it's kind of it just becomes a necessity.
But why you, Nigel? What did you think that you brought to this, to the movement, to the advocacy at this stage? Did you feel a calling, or were you kind of like dragged screaming and kicking into this?
Well, I didn't think I brought very much to it at all, but I just felt I had to do something. So there's an inner drive, but what? And I was just incredibly lucky because very early on, when I got involved, I met people who knew what to do, and that was the really great thing. I had a very dear friend who became a very dear friend, who was a very good lawyer, and suddenly I was working with a group of people who understood how you brought about change in Parliament, in the civil service, in government, how you work with international institutions, with the Council of Europe, the United Nations, and they empowered me actually, and so we all worked together. But I find this very exciting, and so I was always thinking, hey, what are we going to do next? What's the next step? What are we doing? And I didn't know what to do, but they would say, well, we should make this submission, or we should draft this law, or we should take this case to the European Court of Human Rights, or whatever it was. And so I'd get behind it and push them along, or if there was something that I could do, then I would do that. So it was kind of a drive, an inner drive.
I'm just curious because I was thinking maybe you were already somebody who was very interested in the law, or you were really good at networking, or you had a really good Rolodex. I think that's what they might have had, or a Filofax at that time, and you just had a lot of contacts. I'm just curious as to what the skills that you brought apart from this drive and this obvious motivation.
I didn't bring skills. In fact, the sort of oppression and the self-oppression is something which hampers your development as an individual. So if you are denying a substantial part of your identity, and if you are feeling really bad about that, and you're depressed and you're not doing the right things, then actually your development is inhibited. So I was not bringing lots of oratory or great intellect or huge legal skills or whatever it was, and I wasn't that kind of person who gets up on the bandstand and makes a speech or goes out and leads the march. So for me, actually, joining the movement, becoming part of it, and getting involved with these wonderful people who knew how things worked was actually a way of developing and trying to catch up on the negative consequences of being kind of repressed all the way through from adolescence through to my mid-20s in terms of my individual development and growth.
You don't have to be a keen student of history to know that the UK in that period was not the easiest environment for people who were LGBTIQ. So what were the immediate aims? What were the goals of your activism when you first started?
Of course, different people in the movement had different aims, but we as a group, the people I was working with, it was very much trying to achieve law reform. And so before '79, before the general election of '79, there was a Labour government, and we were hoping to push some things through that. But that was not easy. They really weren't very interested at all. And then, of course, Maggie Thatcher came in 1979, and what we saw was that the Conservative members of Parliament who supported us, there were a few, they soon evaporated. They began saying, well, actually, in this new world we're in, there's not much we can do. So we plugged away for 10 years, or more than 10 years actually, trying to change stuff in Parliament. But a lot of our attention then switched to the international field because we got excited by that. There was a lot that could be done there too.
Nigel, was that a strategic move, given that this was the period when Section 28 was introduced in the UK?
Well, Section 28 came in a bit later than I'm talking about. So Section 28, I mean, we were going on, as our committee, we were going on working on the domestic scene as well, through to the late 80s. So we were there, sort of, fighting Section 28 along with everybody else. The point was we didn't really have a voice. In the Thatcher era, it was very hard to get in the media. It was almost impossible to get issues raised in Parliament. It was very difficult to get change through more informal methods through the civil service. So we actually had very, very little influence, and that was Section 28. Ironically, changed all that, because what had happened up till through the 70s and through into the late 80s was that the kind of people who really would be able to change things politically were not engaged with the lesbian and gay movement, as it then was. That they were outside. We were outsiders, as it were. We were not part of the establishment, and it took Section 28 to bring mainly gay men with the kind of influence and clout that was needed to begin change. And of course, that led to the setting up of Stonewall, which some of my colleagues on our committee were co-founders of. So the committee that we had and were working on in this organisation, which was called the Campaign for Homosexual Equality, some of those people then went in and helped to found Stonewall and set Stonewall up at the end of the decade. So it was part of an organic growth. I don't think there wasn't something non-strategic in the sense that we gave up and then Section 28 happened. It was something. There was a world in which we were not able to influence things, and Section 28 was going to happen whatever we did.
Was the push towards the European dimension, Nigel, a reflection that you wanted to locate the rights of LGBTIQ people within this wider concept of human rights, the evolving human rights as we began to understand it, and that's why you wanted to connect at the European level? Was that an influence, or was there something else in your understanding of the situation?
No, that was a very strong influence, and actually it grew out of a connection right at the beginning of the founding of the International of ILGA. At the founding meeting in 1978 in Coventry, one of the people who came to that was someone called Jeff Dudgeon from Northern Ireland, and he's still active in Northern Ireland. And at that stage, the criminal law that still applied in Northern Ireland, so sex between men was completely illegal. And his house was raided, I think it's about 1976, and he was arrested and held by the police. And he used that as a basis for taking a case to the European Court of Human Rights, challenging the criminalisation in Northern Ireland. So this was the beginning of the human rights agenda. Up to that point, people had taken cases mainly from Germany challenging discrimination on grounds of sexual orientation in the criminal law, and they'd all been rejected. And Jeff's case was one. He won his case. That was 1981, and that was a huge breakthrough for us because what was then happening was that the UK lesbian and gay community were then using the international human rights mechanisms to force change in the UK. And so a year later, in 1982, the Northern Ireland law, the British government was finally compelled to change the Northern Ireland law. But that was a consequence of the Council of Europe, the European Court of Human Rights saying to the UK, this criminalisation of relationships between men in Northern Ireland is a violation of the European Convention on Human Rights. So that was only a very strong motivation for us because it showed us what we could do through accessing the European Court of Human Rights. And I was one of the lawyers I was working with very closely, who became such a good friend for 40 years. He actually prepared the case for the court, for Jeff. And as soon as we'd won it, I said to him, "Come on, this is good. Let's do some more cases." And so he lodged a whole series of more cases covering things like the age of consent and armed forces and other issues that were still illegal in the UK. And they were all rejected out of hand. The people in Strasbourg just said, no case to answer. The British government can discriminate in these ways. And so what was happening was that Strasbourg, the people around the European Court, they were saying, sorry, gay rights are not human rights, other than in the very limited circumstances of the Dudgeon judgment. And that situation remained in place until 1997. So for 16 years, case after case after case went to Strasbourg on sexual orientation discrimination, and case after case after case was just back to the back, no case to answer, doesn't even meet the first, doesn't even get a hearing, doesn't even get beyond the very basic grounds that you have in the case. So that was interesting. So we engaged with Europe, and we engaged quite a lot, but it was a mixed experience. After the Dudgeon case, which seemed so good and so positive, things were bad. But one has to remember that the Dudgeon case was really very important for Europe as a whole, because not only did it force the British government to change the law in Northern Ireland, it also, over the next 20 years, it became the standard. It became the European standard, and it meant that another 22 jurisdictions had to change their laws, had to decriminalise. So it had a huge consequence over 20 years, especially with the fall of the Iron Curtain. A lot of the former communist countries still had bans on sex between two people of the same sex. And so they all had to repeal their laws. So literally millions and millions and millions of people had the threat of criminalisation and prosecution lifted from them. So it was a fantastic development, but it was just a pity that that Strasbourg was so pusillanimous, I think, so cowardly or so prejudiced that it took another 16 years for the convention system to take another step forward.
Did you find your calling then in making these legal appeals, trying to overturn clear situations of bias? Did you find something in you that really responded to that and understood what was required, and you jumped in with great enthusiasm into that aspect of campaigning and activism?
Well, it really appealed to me very, very strongly. It wasn't my calling in the sense that I was never the expert who could do it, although much more recently I've got a bit more involved with these things and learned a bit about some of the simpler things to do. It was always this very good friend of mine, Peter Ashman, who actually conducted the cases and did the work and provided the expertise. He somehow always knew who you talked to in Strasbourg and how you contacted people in the Parliamentary Assembly, even in the days before the internet and websites and things. He somehow knew all these things, and so he was the guiding spirit. And I went along and I did some of the donkey work basically, and helped him along. And then when he was getting too busy doing other things, kind of badgered him until he started doing some more. That was basically my role.
I make the point because there's an understanding for many people, I'm sure, including myself, that activism is something that happens in the streets with placards or increasingly in television studios or on the internet or the writing of pamphlets. But if you look at all civil rights, human rights movements, there's also this sort of other side, which is about the painstaking detail, the appeal to legal case law, and hoping to change minds through discussions and dialogue with the power brokers. And that seems to me the part that you really warm to.
Yes, I think that's right. I think you have to do it all. I mean, I've been on countless demonstrations and some media events. But you have to do it all. There's no one saying one is better than the other, but they play together. So if you do them all, then you're affecting different parts of society, different parts of the community, and you're leveraging one against the other. So we leverage, the European Court of Human Rights in the Dudgeon case provided the leverage to get the change in Northern Ireland that had been refused repeatedly over the previous decade. And it also led indirectly to the change in Scotland that happened afterwards. So you're leveraging one against the other, and you gradually build up. You use one to get a bit further in this direction, and then another lever gets you a bit further ahead in public opinion, and when you've improved the public opinion, then another lever gets you a bit further here, and so you keep building up. But underneath it all, you have to have social change. Underneath it all, I mean, the Council of Europe and the EU and international institutions are wonderful levers. They create space, but underneath in that space, they create headroom where the governments can't discriminate to come out. Underneath that, society has to develop. Underneath that, people's opinions have to be changed. And that is, and that's a problem.
It's a question I put to each guest in these deep dive podcasts, and I'll ask you, Nigel. Does the arc of history bend towards progress?
I've been a huge enthusiast for that viewpoint up till very recently, because we've had such extraordinary change in West Europe on LGBTI rights, incredible change, and change which, going back 50 years when I was young, I couldn't have imagined. So, and we've seen the extraordinary progress of democratization and the development of human rights and so on, and the international rule of law and so on developing in Europe especially. And so I've been very keen on that idea. The last 3 or 4 years have left me very concerned, because we've seen very, very regressive things happening in Europe, and around the world. We've seen the rise of populist politicians. We've seen those populist politicians taking power, and then we've seen them morphing into authoritarian governments, which we have in Poland, in Hungary, in Turkey, and of course have long now had in Russia. And then what you begin to understand is how incredibly vulnerable this whole concept of democracy and human rights and the rule of law is. It's very vulnerable. And unless it's very well entrenched and resilient to pressures, it can collapse very, very quickly. It can be subverted in a matter of months or a couple of years by determined populist politicians who don't really care about it and just want to grab power, hold on to it, enrich themselves, whatever it is they want. And if you look around Europe, of course, virtually every one of the, I think it's 22 of the Council of Europe member states are former communist countries. Every one of them, very few of them have really strong democratic institutions. Every one of them is vulnerable to this kind of populism. So, and indeed, they aren't alone. As we see what's happening in Austria, possibly in Italy with the elections coming up, who knows? It could well be that the populist governments are going to become more and more entrenched in the countries we thought really safe in West Europe. So, it's a matter of real concern, and I think things can go backwards. And I'm talking now not specifically about LGBTI rights. I'm talking generally about human rights, about democracy, about the rule of law. I think this is a very big concern, and of course Brexit is looking at it from the UK angle, is a very unfortunate contributor to this, because it undermines and weakens the EU, which has been a huge positive force for change in terms of entrenching democracy, fighting corruption, supporting the rule of law, and all those things in Europe. So yeah, I'm concerned now in a way that I have not been in decades, about the possibility that things are now going backwards more generally. If they go backwards generally, then they will go back, certainly in some parts of Europe, for LGBTI rights, because LGBTI rights progress in former communist countries depends on the human rights and the rule of law, depends on being able to demonstrate access to the media, all those things. And if you haven't got those, you can't move forward.
Nigel, you put your finger on something which I think is central to our conversation. How do you explain the evolution in public attitudes towards homosexuals and transgender people, or the LGBTI community?
Yeah, exactly. Overall, well, it's a long and slow process, and I've touched on it in different ways so far. It has to start with people coming out, with those close contacts of individuals. And well, it has to start actually one step before that. It has to start with the democratic institutions and rule of law being in place that enable people to come out and not feel endangered and able to express their opinions, access the media, demonstrate, all those things. You need those. And you start with that small group of people, and then it moves through into the youth culture, because you need a generational change is very important. And what you do find is that it takes a generation for the attitudes really to begin to shift, and that's because younger people are coming through who haven't grown up with the deep prejudices. And then you have to get into the media, because the media, of course, has a reach that we as individual activists can never have in terms of population. So popular soap operas, things like that, it's really very important that same-sex couples or trans people or whoever are represented and become part of, if you like, of the wallpaper of people's homes. And then what happens is that politicians start being not frightened, because they begin seeing the opinion polls saying, actually, people aren't so against these people anymore. And what that leads to is, on the one hand, those who were always supportive but frightened to do something, doing something, and on the other hand, those that exploited homophobia and transphobia, and of course they're all over the place for political aims. Demonising the LGBTIQ community is a popular pastime in many European countries. They begin seeing that that's actually going to lose them votes. And then suddenly you get a very sharp change. Then suddenly there's a pivot. It's like a seesaw or something, or a pivotal change, and you get very quick change. That was the experience in the UK in the 2000s. That's when finally the Conservatives realised that it was losing them votes and making them unpopular to go on opposing LGBT rights. So that's the way I see it happening. That's the experience of the UK that I've just described. But I think it's probably not a bad model for other countries. So of course every country has their own way of doing things and their own particular process.
It seems to me that the Second World War and the experience of homosexuals in Nazi Germany was actually quite important, because we became aware after the Second World War of just how terrible the actions were of the medical establishment in Germany against homosexuals. That it perhaps was easier then for activists that predated you, Nigel, to overcome the medicalization of homosexuality, so to speak, so that activists were able to take away that power and to reframe the conversation so that it wasn't an issue of psychiatry or psychological difficulties. And so all those other things that you've just mentioned took place afterwards, and that made it that much easier for a new environment to be created. Is that a fair analysis, Nigel?
I think there's something in that. Yes, if you go back in time, then homosexuality, for example, was seen as an illness. Of course, it's important to remember that the World Health Organization didn't remove homosexuality from its list of illnesses until, I think it was 1990. I forget the exact year, but around then. But it's still the case. I mean, it's in the case through to the 1970s. I knew people who in the UK who in the 1970s had been treated, or certainly in the 1960s, were treated with things like shock therapy, aversion therapy. So homosexuality was still being treated as an illness by some people in the UK till quite far on. But it is, I think, true that there was, I mean, we all, everyone always says the famous saying, we all stand on the shoulders of giants. I mean, there were great people who had been doing things in different countries, particularly, of course, Germany, going back to the 1900s, well, going back to the 1850s or 60s, if you look at the history. But, of course, a huge amount of their efforts were wiped out by the Nazis. So there was change going on. I think where the change came through was in certain particular countries. So it's very interesting if you look at the development of the lesbian and gay movement in Europe. The organisations, in some countries, organisations came into existence immediately after the war. They were public organisations, so the Netherlands and Scandinavia, basically. And I think they benefited and were the sort of torchbearers. But in other countries, like the UK, of course, the criminalisation remained. So I'm not sure that the sort of demedicalisation that was taking place in the 1930s and so on necessarily helped very much in the UK.
All of these things have taken place in your lifetime, of course. You've seen the changing environment. What now would be the aims of your activism?
Well, there's still a huge amount to do. We talked a certain amount about the former communist world, if you like. Europe now, the Council of Europe, if you like, divides very clearly 50-50. There's 47 member states of the Council of Europe, if you like, and of those, just about half, 23. 22 are the former communist states, and one is Turkey. And those are the countries where very big problems remain. So, as far as I'm concerned, the number one priority, or a very major priority, is supporting the movement in those countries, making sure that and this is where the Council of Europe is so important, and the EU also very important, is giving them the headroom to work, making sure they're protected, making sure they can exercise the rights to freedom of assembly, bringing court cases against them when they fail to protect them from hate crimes, or when they, as in the case of Russia, bring in discriminatory laws. That's a really important process, and it's a process that's going to take a lot of time, because they've got to go through that history which I described earlier. They've got to go through. We've got very good, wonderful activists in those countries. They're doing fantastic jobs. They're experienced, excellent people, but they've got to be given the support so that they can change public attitudes, and that's not an easy thing to do. So they need to be protected and be able to exercise the rights to do that and access the media. Those are really important things. So that's East Europe and Southeast Europe. The other very big priorities, transgender rights is a huge priority. It's really sort of come onto the scene in a big way in the last decade or so, thanks in quite a large measure actually to the second Council of Europe Human Rights Commissioner, Thomas Hammerberg, who really did an awful lot on trans rights. The human rights issues around trans rights are now much better understood. So that's the basic problem for transgender people. Well, there are many problems, but one big problem is that there are not easily accessible ways of transitioning from one gender to the other in a very large number of member states of the Council of Europe, and a great many member states of the Council of Europe, 20 I think it is, still impose medical conditions on people who want to transition, and those medical conditions can often involve surgery and even sterilisation. 20 states require sterilisation. So there's a huge battle to be fought here across many, many states to get proper, fair procedures in place that are based, allowing trans people to get what we call legal gender recognition, legal recognition of their self-determined gender. But it's very exciting because that's going fast. It's a relatively new development. In a few years, quite a few countries have taken positive steps. I think a very large number are taking further steps. There's been a big victory at the European Court of Human Rights last year when the court ruled against France that requiring sterilisation was a violation of the convention. And that will be a little bit like, for trans people, that will be a little bit like the Dudgeon judgment was for same-sex relations. That will force change all across Europe, all across these 20 countries that still require sterilisation. So that's a big victory, and one that will lead to a lot of change in the coming years. So that's one big area. Then there's another area affecting a much smaller group of people, intersex people, largely forgotten up till now. The problem here is the awful problem that parents and doctors, when a baby is born with the genitals of both sexes, they feel obliged to guess in some way what the gender identity of the child is, and then make an operation at that time that's irreversible. And this can be a terrible mistake. And so this is becoming an issue that's coming onto the agenda. The Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe did a very good resolution on this last year, setting out the ground rules, setting out the basic principles that member states should be following on this. And that's an area where more work is to be done.
Nigel, you've provided me with a perfect segue to discuss the victories of the last 40 or 50 years in which you've been active. So you've mentioned the victory at the European Court last year. What other high points would you look at?
Well, one high point which I wasn't personally involved with at all, but it was incredibly important and largely unknown, I think, was that in 1997 the EU adopted, in the Treaty of Amsterdam, it adopted the powers to combat discrimination on a number of grounds, and one of those was sexual orientation. So quite suddenly, the EU had adopted a position on lesbian and gay rights, and it had given itself the powers to take action. Now that was enormously important, because then there came soon afterwards the Charter of Fundamental Rights, which enshrines sexual orientation in the non-discrimination article. There came the Employment Directive, which outlawed discrimination on grounds of sexual orientation in the field of employment right across the EU, therefore in the end across 28 member states, and a number of other developments. And I think those are incredibly important, because these legal changes, they're not just changes in the law, they affect behaviour. So when you ban employment discrimination, what you're doing is saying to all employers, if you discriminate on grounds of sexual orientation, you're going to find yourself in court facing large costs. So reputable and sensible employers then put in place measures to make sure they don't get in court. And of course the judges in countries that are efficient and run their laws properly, the judges all get trained, the civil servants all get trained. And so what you see, a law like that drives change right through the governmental and social system in a way that individual activists can't. When we try and do something on the ground, like people go into a school and give a talk on LGBTI rights or something, you're talking to a small number of kids, but what you have to do is actually get the state itself to take up the cause and change the curriculum in schools, change the way companies behave, change the way employment legislation operates, change how recruitment works. So that is enormously important. So that was a huge and largely unrecognised gain. And in the context of Brexit, it's incredibly sad because, of course, that shows the way in which the EU could be so effective and useful to everybody. So that's one. I think the second thing which was very valuable to us was that after 97, and it may be no coincidence that that the EU had adopted a strong position, the Council of Europe suddenly began adopting a stronger position. So suddenly, having won no court cases at the European Court for Human Rights for 16 years, suddenly from 97 onwards, we began winning cases. And those cases were really important because they built, and they were across things like the armed forces, the age of consent, parenting, custody rights, and if you're a parent, things like that. And they enshrined the principle of non-discrimination. They said you can't discriminate. And that was really important because that then began getting towards the point we want to get where LGBT rights are human rights. So when we're no longer discriminated against, our rights are no longer seen as being less than human. They're part of the general human rights standards. And those changes, and then the problems that arose in East Europe, led the Council of Europe from what happens from 2004 onwards. What we then saw was that LGBT activists in East Europe began demonstrating much more. They began trying to assert their rights, and states clamped down on them. Poland, Latvia, etc., etc., etc. Initially, when they began trying to exercise their rights, they were clamped down on. And that led to the Council of Europe saying, we need to have a recommendation to member states on the rights of lesbian, gay, bisexual and trans people. And that led to this Committee of Ministers recommendation to the member states, which you began by talking about at the very beginning. So those are some exciting developments from my narrow perspective. I wasn't involved in all of them, but by any means, but from a sort of European perspective, they are very important developments.
How has the internet changed LGBTIQ activism, Nigel?
Well, of course, it's changed incredibly. I mean, when we started on the international work back in '78, well, if I go right back to Stonewall, how did the spirit of Stonewall get to London from New York? Well, two students from the LSE were on holiday in New York in 1970, and they went to a meeting of activists, and they heard about pride and coming out. And so they came back and started holding meetings at the LSE for activists. And so in those days it was sort of word of mouth, fax, telephone calls. Now, of course, ideas can spread in seconds to huge audiences. So the world has been absolutely transformed. And if you're working internationally, it makes it very much easier for an organisation like ILGA, which now has, I think it's 1,200 member organisations in 130 odd countries. It makes it far easier to operate. When we were trying to run ILGA back in the 70s and 80s, everything was by post and print photocopying and sending it out, and 2 months later getting a reply, that kind of thing. It was very, very slow. Progress was very, very difficult. Now you can whistle up a lot of support in a very short time. But of course, this works both ways. It means that the opposition also, so the conservative religious folk who are uniting and working in such a coherent way to try and block progress on LGBTIQ rights, they are linked up all from America throughout Europe, Russia, and Africa and Latin America. So it works on both sides.
On that point, Nigel, have you always had this sense that you are, or gay rights or LGBTIQ rights, are at the centre of this cultural war that's taking place?
Well, I think it's actually slightly the other way. I don't think we see ourselves as part of a cultural war.
Well, you might not see yourself as that, but certainly the opponents see LGBTIQ rights as a totem of this cultural war that they wish to fight.
Yes, they do. And what I said is a note, just no simplification. You've got two things happening. You've got the conservative religious folk who, you're completely right, see it as a central aspect of their cultural war, along with abortion rights and sexual health and reproductive rights and those things. And then what you've got playing into that is this very unpleasant, I think I was referred to as an unholy alliance. You've got populist politicians then saying, we've got something here we can use to bolster our popularity domestically or internationally. And so you then have populist politicians who may or may not have any interest in religion, using these cultural issues, if you like, as a way of promoting their popularity. So Russia is the classic example. Putinist Russia has been propagating this notion of traditional values for quite a long time now at the UN and around the world. I have no idea what Putin's religious views are. I would be surprised if they really exist in any deep sense. His interest entirely is in holding on to power, and so his interest is in demonizing groups of people at home so that he remains popular, and his interest is in building alliances with other countries internationally who may hold the same views, and so he can carry favour with them by leading this attack on by supporting traditional values. That gains him support in quite a few countries around the world. So it's a clever political play, and of course it's been a very effective political play when he introduced the so-called propaganda of homosexuality, and also the law prohibiting what they so-called propaganda of homosexuality, in other words, any publicity about homosexuality in Russia. That was supported by very heavy support, 70-something%, according to the opinion polls, supported it. So he knew what ground he was on, and it was a purely political play. But of course, it delighted the Orthodox Church, whose support he wants as well. So he was winning all the way around on that one.
Would it be fair to say, Nigel, that one of the successes of LGBTIQ activism over the last 40 years was to make LGBTIQ people less threatening to the mainstream population? And this is why laws have been changed. This is why there is greater respect for the human rights of LGBTIQ people. But what we're seeing now is a reversion to an older idea that LGBTIQ people are once again threatening, not just threatening, but also dangerous in our culture, in our societies. Is that a fair analysis? And if it is, how do you, in alliance with other human rights activists, move to the situation where LGBTIQ people are just the same as everybody else and no less, no more threatening than everybody else? How do we move to that situation?
Well, so starting with the analysis, if you like, of being threatening, it's of course pitched very much with the idea that LGBTIQ people are threatening to children and a threat to the traditional family. So it's that's what they're holding up as the sort of bogey. How do we fight back against that? Well, I think that the campaign in Ireland around same-sex marriage and the referendum and all that was a model for how to do it. It's all about humanizing. It's all about the human touch. It was slightly galling for me, as someone who's spent all my life talking about human rights and so on, and thinking that was the winner, to discover that actually in the public discourse, human rights doesn't really make much difference to anybody. What matters is showing that people are human. In fact, this is going right back to the principle of coming out. That's at the foundation of gay liberation. What matters is showing that people are human, and what you have to, and that's how you have to get it across. And so, in the Irish campaign, as I understand it, a tremendous emphasis was placed on showing individuals in the context of their families, with their parents, with their children if they had children, showing the children in same-sex families, in rainbow families. That's the way to do it. It's of course not easy to do, and it's rather glib to say it, but it's humanizing, rehumanizing. They're trying to dehumanize LGBT people. They're trying to demonize LGBTIQ people. What we have to do is to fight back by humanizing LGBTIQ people, and that's about. It's about emotional. It's about touching the emotions it's about trying to touch the emotions rather than trying to touch reason. I think human rights is a discourse about reason. This is a discourse about empathy, about people empathizing with each other.
In that context then, Nigel, what is the place for the kind of, let's call it, provocative tactics used by ACT UP in the 1980s in the UK and other organisations? as you say, this is now about winning hearts and minds. Is there still a role for those kinds of shock tactics?
Yes, I think so. I'm very reluctant to throw away any bit of the toolkit. Of course, there has to be the right time and the right place, and that's always a matter of judgment. It's always a matter of judgment as to what you do and when you do it. But there's going to be times when shock tactics of some kind are going to be very necessary. Thinking of a different context, of course, Pussy Riot, for example, have been. Sadly, I don't think they're active anymore. But for a time, they were using the kind of shock tactics, and in Russia. It's very I don't know whether the Russian activists would agree, but looking at it from outside, it's almost the only way you're going to get any media attention, get anyone hearing or listening or noticing you. The problem now is that the moment you appear on the streets in Russia, the police appear and you're closed down, and you can't march, you can't demonstrate, you can't get any publicity, and you have to have publicity. You have to be in the media. You need, otherwise you're invisible, and you can change nothing. So there are going to be times when the ACT-UP kind of measures or the shock tactics, if you like, are absolutely necessary.
Nigel, what do you make of those people who say that they don't want to return to a period when LGBTIQ people were persecuted and had to live in terrible situations and couldn't be the people that they wanted to be? But what they're worried about is political correctness going too far in the wrong direction, particularly on issues to do with gay adoption and the right of artificial insemination. What do you make of that as an argument?
Well, I think people who complain about political correctness going too far, very often this is a way of masking their own residual or remaining discriminatory attitudes. So you have to say, well, what is the attitude underlying their comment that they really want to say? And what they really want to say, what they're really thinking is same-sex couples or rainbow families or whatever it is are a danger to children. So parenting by same-sex couples is a danger to children. That's really what they're saying. Of course, and then you have to respond to that with the facts, which are the facts, which is that there's no evidence that rainbow families are a problem. And on the occasions when the conservative religious people have tried to prove that, they have produced completely fake evidence. So there is no evidence, and the attempts by the religious right to produce this evidence were fatally flawed and actually backfired, because it was the flaws were so patently obvious that it didn't take more than a few minutes for most people to understand that the information was completely unreliable and was bogus.
We've talked about the history of your involvement in gay activism or LGBTIQ activism, and I didn't mention at all the impact of HIV, particularly in the 1980s. And I've been listening to podcasts recently which have talked about how activism around that was very important in a political context as well. Is that something that you can speak to too, Nigel?
Yes, briefly. The main consequence that you're after, it affected a lot of, how can I put it, the influential gay men who were not putting their money or their efforts into gay activism at that point, and suddenly they found themselves with a very sad and serious issue which needed to be fought. And so it got them into the world of fundraising, of trying to combat the AIDS hysteria, the political attacks on AIDS, and also then the attacks on the gay community, because of course in the early days it was called the gay plague, and there were horrendous media misrepresentations of the situation. And so it greatly widened the pool of people who were willing to work on LGBT rights in the end. And so that was a very important thing. And then in the UK that then fed into Section 28. Section 28 came along, and it was those same people who then also felt that they were now going to engage publicly with lesbian and gay rights through Section 28, this law that was trying to prohibit education on same-sex issues in schools.
Does it worry you, however, that LGBTIQ activists and the politics behind it are now part of another game, in the sense that countries and politicians who hitherto would not be considered to be the friends of the LGBTIQ movement are quite happy to associate themselves with LGBTIQ communities and politics because they're more interested in a larger a larger cultural context, which is the clash between Christian European societies and Muslim societies. Is that something that you're aware of?
It's what we call pink washing. So it's where you get populist politicians, right-wing populist politicians, who are sympathetic to lesbian and gay rights. So then there's plenty of them. Some of them are lesbian or gay, and who then want to use and who then want to give themselves credibility and get support in the community by saying, look, we support gay rights, and then they adopt their xenophobic anti-Muslim agenda. This is very unfortunate, and what we have to do is to keep calling it out. So it's what we call pink washing, and it has to be called out as such, and we have to make it clear continuously that it's part of an unpleasant populist agenda that we want to have no part of. The fact that somebody who espouses this kind of approach seems supportive of lesbian or gay rights or LGBTQI rights, that's not a reason for us to support them or honour them or in any way dignify them.
That's a hard position to adopt because there's not been much progress in Muslim societies on this issue of LGBTIQ rights. Let's just say that there is a sense that LGBTIQ activism is loud and proud in Europe and in Western countries, but hasn't had the same global impact elsewhere. Would that be a fair assessment?
Yes, it's a fair assessment. There are parts of the world where things are so repressive that it's really very difficult for a movement to exist at all. There are many other parts where movements exist, but there are difficulties. I think the way to tackle the problems within communities who are particularly homophobic or transphobic, and that can be branches of Christianity, just as it can be branches of Islam and so on, is through building LGBTIQ communities and supporting them within those churches or within those faiths, and trying to change things from within. I think that's the way to do it. You have to, obviously, you have to protest and call out the appalling things that have been done in some countries at some stages. That doesn't mean that you should espouse and support and dignify populist politicians who are trying to exploit this divide for their own purposes within European countries, for example.
I've spoken with black LGBTIQ activists, and no one wants to say it out loud, but they say that they're not really well represented. Also, lesbians say that they're also not really represented, that this movement has become too dominated by white men. Is that a criticism that you would accept?
I think it's worth trying to split the issue into the two separate parts, the race issue and the gender issue. The problem is that LGBTIQ communities on the whole in general begin to reflect the makeup of the wider communities in which they're situated. Undoubtedly you're going to find racism or separation or whatever it is within those communities, and then what that does is inhibit or prevent people from black or minority ethnic groups becoming involved in activism, in mainstream activism in their own countries. And then we see this in ILGA-Europe at our conferences. There's very few people from black or minority ethnic backgrounds, and that's a source of great concern to us, and ILGA-Europe has been working for a long time on trying to improve diversity, but it's a very difficult thing to do top down. But the truth is that the answer to difficulties about diversity has to be within the communities, and then what you then see at the end of the day is the changes coming through to representative organisations, for example. That's possibly an oversimplification. There are things you can do, but there's not a lot. At least I think it's very difficult to do. On the gender front, I think it's more complex than that. Certainly, from what I see. Of course, we all only see what we see. There's all the things we aren't involved with, and all the countries we aren't involved with, and so on. What we had was going right back to the 70s or early 80s. Was a movement that was very male-dominated, and there was indeed within the community, within the gay community, I'll call it, there was a lot of sexism. It was actually, some of it was actually a consequence of oppression. So you're oppressed, and so you then oppress people who you seem next weaker, and so the women get turned on, or the women get demonised, or not, or just being treated despicably, or being treated with rudeness, or talked about behind their backs with rudeness. Then we had a very interesting thing in the very early days of the International Lesbian and Gay Association. It was 1980 or 81 when the women walked out. They just said, we've had enough of this, had enough of your patriarchy and your patriarchal ways, and they walked out. And that was a very interesting, for people like me, that was a very positive shock, because it sort of really confronted us. It made us think, we felt very rejected and very hurt, and it really made us think about where we were and who we were, and why they would have walked out. Interestingly, then, of course, we were talking about the HIV and AIDS crisis in the UK. One of the things that brought the communities of women and men back together again was the fight against AIDS. So that was an interesting development. Sitting where I am now and working a lot with East Europe, I see, certainly the people that I see, women very well represented. I mean, I'll just give you one completely isolated and no doubt unrepresentative example, but in January we hosted a study visit of activists from Russia, from Armenia and Georgia at the Council of Europe. I think there were 8, I think, and I think we had 6 women and 2 trans people, and there you are. That's what we had. So, and if we go to our and what I just think it's fantastic what we see in this very difficult environment in East Europe are these wonderfully courageous women working away as often the core of the movement or a large part of it. So I'm not sure that this rule holds. I suspect if you went to South Europe, Southern Europe, you might find it different, but certainly Central and Eastern Europe, my experience is that lesbians are very well represented in the movement, and women are well represented generally.
What are you working on now? What is the most urgent campaign that you're involved in at the moment?
Because the kind of work I do, it tends to be a bit reactive, and it tends to be you go on and on and on, working on particular situations or particular things. So the word urgent, meaning let's do something now, that doesn't necessarily come up. I mean, it may come up in relation to need to make a submission quickly. If I look wider, and I'm not particularly working on this, but of course the urgent situations that we've heard about are in relation to particularly disturbing situations, in relation to the very severe repression faced by LGBTIQ people in Chechnya, for example, and in Azerbaijan in the recent times. So that there's 2 very difficult problems, and I'm not personally involved with this, but my colleagues in LGA-Europe are involved very much in aspects of that. And there's all sorts of aspects. There's the difficulties about protecting the people who feel threatened. Some need to be refugees and get out of countries, and so on and so forth. So there's a lot of problems, and that kind of work is very urgent.
Finally then, Nigel, after a career spanning more than 40 years of activism on behalf of LGBTIQ people, what keeps you going?
In fact, hoping to wind down a year or 2 ago, and I've become so concerned about the way the threats to human rights in Europe and the rule of law and all the things that the Council of Europe stands for over the last few years, with a whole host of things which I won't go into now, it's too long to do, that I feel I want to go on a bit. And in fact, I've recently got involved with a new organisation which isn't to do with the LGBTIQ world, particularly. It's to do with implementing judgments of the European Court of Human Rights. So a small group of us has recently set up something called the European Implementation Network, not the jazziest of names, and we have a little office in Strasbourg, and we have our wonderful staff there, and what we are doing is trying to strengthen the way in which strengthen the European Court of Human Rights work by trying to make sure that when a judgment is granted, that it's properly implemented, because unless it's carried out on the ground and all the steps taken necessary to make sure the same violation of human rights isn't repeated, if those steps aren't taken, then that long process of winning a case, and it can take 10 or 15 years, so much of that is wasted. And this is another way that I personally have of trying to do a little bit of something somewhere to try to support and strengthen human rights in Europe when they are under such threat. Nigel Warner, thank you.